we are going through a sermon series called Underdogs. And my question to you is, there's a few questions that I'll have this morning, but one of my questions is, have you ever felt like God was against you? Have you ever felt like God was against you? Because it's one thing to have the world against you, or have your boss against you, or have some other people against you. But when you have somebody who is designing your life and helping you all along the way, and you seek him out to provide for your needs and protect you, have you ever felt like that person has been against you? Maybe you've had that in your family or your friends where it's like, man, I can stand having some people who are outside of my intimate circle against me. But man, when I have a family member or when I have a close friend turn against me, that is really difficult. And we know as followers of Jesus Christ that Jesus does not leave us or forsake us. We know that he promises that in Scripture. But at the same time, I remember when my parents used to discipline me or whatever, and I felt like they were against me. And my question is, do you ever feel like God is against you? Because we're going to be going through a situation in the life of Daniel where he could very easily have seen that God might have been against him. And in the midst of that, if God is against him, then what good is it? I mean, if God's against you, then why even fight? Why even try to get on his good side? Why not just do whatever you're going to do and suffer the consequences? If there was ever a moment in history where the people of Israel felt like God was against them, it was during the time of Daniel. And this is what we learn in Daniel. A little bit about the background is this. Number one is that Babylon defeated Judah. We need to understand a little bit about the history of Israel and the history of Judah. Okay? So back in the day, back in the Old Testament, God gave Abraham a promise. And that promise was he was going to give him a nation, amongst other things, he was going to give him a nation and a land, a promised land. And so Abraham took that, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and Jacob had 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And so what had happened was one of those sons got shipped into slavery out to Egypt, but then the family moved out to Egypt, if you remember that. And so then they got established in Egypt, but about 400 years later, there was, during that time, there was an Egyptian king who did not remember what Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, had done for Egypt. And so basically what happened was the Israelites were enslaved for 400 years. And then God raised up Moses, and Moses took them out of Egypt and into wandering in the desert for 40 years. Joshua took them into the promised land, and they established themselves as a kingdom and as a nation. What God had promised Abraham became realized in Joshua at that time. But there was rebellion by Israel against God. And so there were people groups that were oppressing Israel. And so they would call out to God, and God would rescue them, but they would go back to their old ways. And God was getting frustrated and tired with this. And then what happened was the people of Israel, instead of wanting God as a king, they wanted a human as a king. And God's like, all right, I was leading you, but if you want a physical king, a human king to lead you instead of me, then that's what we're going to do. And so we know the story of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon. And then right after Solomon, there was a son by the name of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was a horrible king. And because he was a horrible king, the kingdom split into two. Into upper northern Israel and to lower Judah. And for most of their time, almost all of the kings, I believe all of the kings of Israel were horrible. There were about 20 of them. There were about 20 kings in Judah, and only about 2 kings in Judah were good. But they were always rebelling against God. Always rebelling against God. And God's like, I can't take this anymore. You are going to be exiled to other nations, and you are going to be oppressed by them for your discipline. But he also says, I have a plan for you. I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to bring a remnant back. And so God always had hope for this. But we find Daniel in the midst of this time with Judah when they were shipped off and exiled to Babylon. Babylon came in, defeated Judah, took over Jerusalem, and exiled the people of Israel to Babylon. And that's where we find ourselves with Daniel. And so it's this really low time for Judah and for Israel. Like, if there was ever a time to be like, it just got to be the worst, now was the time that it was the worst for Judah. And if there was ever a time where they felt that God had turned their back on them, although he didn't, but it felt like God had turned their back on them, it would have been now. Now, this is what happened to the vast majority of the people in Israel and Judah. They sold out. They're like, God is against us, and so we're just going to incorporate ourselves into society, into Babylonian society, or at that time Assyrian society too, and we're just going to intermingle. But there were a few people, there was a remnant that says, even though this is what has happened because of our rebellion against God, I am still going to be faithful to the Lord in this. And that's where we find Daniel. So Babylon had defeated Judah. The people of Judah were exiled to Babylon. So they had to leave their homeland and be exiled back over to the land of Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar, this is what he did. He took the best of the best in Judah. And he took the best and the brightest for his royal service. Because that's what you do as a king. If you take somebody over, you take the good people and you put them into your royal service. You take the bad people and you make them slaves. That's what you do. And so here is Daniel living in the midst of a Babylonian people and realize that he has to engage this culture. Have you ever had to engage a culture when you're a follower of Jesus Christ? It's not always easy. In fact, we see that more often because we see that the culture becomes more and more counter to Christianity. Well, in this situation, this is exactly what Daniel was experiencing. And one of the tests that he had was they were offering food to him that was, according to the Lord's law, defiled. Okay, it could have been pork, it could have been bacon, oh my goodness. It could have been a variety of those foods that God had said, do not eat. And so Daniel was at a crossroads. You see, he was serving the king Nebuchadnezzar, and so he could either just go ahead and go with whatever Nebuchadnezzar wants and forget about God, or he could honor God, but that meant defying the king. And that meant maybe getting persecuted, being thrown in prison, or even being killed. Because at that point in time, defying the king meant death. And so that's where we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open up to Daniel chapter 1. And this is the first test for Daniel, the underdog. You see, not only was he going against the authorities, but he was also going for God, but it felt like God had already forsaken him. But in the midst of that situation, Daniel was still faithful to the Lord. This is where we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 1 Daniel chapter 1 starting in verse 5. It says this, the king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine for his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So these were the best and brightest of Judah. They were being trained for 3 years. They were getting their graduate degree, essentially, in royal service, and then they were going to be put into the royal service. So they were probably learning languages, they were probably learning art, they were probably learning culture, they were probably learning the technology of that day, and then they were going to be put into the royal service. And so Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, otherwise known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were 4 of the young chosen men from all the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them the Babylonian names. Daniel was named Belteshazzar. Hananiah was named Shadrach. Mishael was named Meshach. And Azariah was named Abednego. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. And so here is Daniel in the midst of being an underdog and in the midst of being shipped out to another land. He was still faithful to God. He was still faithful to his laws. He was still faithful to the way that the Lord wanted him to live. My question to you is this. In the midst of difficulties going on in your life, are you still faithful to the Lord? Do you still honor him? Now, we're never going to be perfect, right? We're never going to be perfect, but in those situations at work where they want you to compromise, with your family, where it's like, I just don't want to do this, or I don't want to do that, with your friends, are you willing to honor God in the midst of difficult things? Daniel was, and this is what happened. Daniel determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat any of these acceptable foods. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. Do you see how God, in the midst of even having his people shipped off, that God was doing something in Daniel's life? He was giving him favor. Why? Because when you honor God, God will honor you. It doesn't always end up the way you want it. But when you honor God, God is going to honor you. And God was working in the midst of this situation. Have you ever had a boss at work that he was like, you know what? This person, I don't necessarily agree with them, but I hear them out. And I'm going to let them do what they do. Well, this is what's happening with Daniel. And God was intricately entwined in this situation. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and favor for Daniel, but he responded, I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths of your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded. And so here is what Daniel's boss is saying. Listen, I want to help you out here, but the king, I have to answer to him. And if you start looking frail, if you start looking anorexic, if you start looking a little, not so good, he's going to have my head. So I don't think we can do this. And so this is what Daniel says. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You see how Daniel was unrelenting yet tactful in this. He went to his boss was like, I don't think we can do this. So then he went to the attendant of the boss and just said, hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to plan a little something here. And he's like, please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. Wow, that doesn't sound very exciting. Right? Daniel said, at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other men who are eating the king's foods. We're going to eat salads and have water. And everybody else can have the defiled food. And we'll just see at the end of 10 days how everybody looks. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. Have you guys ever seen the documentary Super Size Me? Okay. Or Forks Over Knives, right? It's the idea of having a plant-based diet versus a meat-based diet or whatever. Super Size Me is all just about eating McDonald's for like 90 days or something like that and all the craziness that happens there, right? Even before that, we have Daniel putting the attendant to the test and just saying, just try it out for 10 days. Nothing bad can happen in 10 days, right? Vegetables and water. And so here is Daniel in the midst of this saying, he's saying the test was honor God or eat defiled food. Honor God or eat defiled food. And here is what Daniel is doing. Daniel is going to obey God, but at the same time, he's also going to be tactful. He's also going to be tactful, and he's also going to be solution-oriented. Sometimes in our walk with Jesus, we're like, I'm just going to take a stand, and that's all I'm going to do. And that's good. But we also realize that tact can also help. Being respectful with people can also help. All right? If I take a stand but I'm disrespectful, if I take a stand but I don't work within the system that I'm arranged, we may not have success, or we might come off as a bit rude or inconsistent, or inconsiderate rather. Now, sometimes we do have to come off as rude and inconsiderate for the sake of Christ. But most of the time, we can also do it respectfully and tactfully. And then if we can be solution-oriented, Daniel was all three. He was tactful to his supervisors, and he was also solution-oriented, saying, he was saying, attendant, listen, 10 days, let's just try it out. Nothing can be bad in 10 days. And this is what happens. Verse 14, the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of food and wine provided for the others. And so we see in the midst of this situation that Daniel being obedient to God, Daniel being respectful to the people around here and being solution-oriented, allowed God to work so that he could be successful. And then, in addition to that, Daniel honored God. And so God honored Daniel. And so that was the first test that Daniel went through. But then we have an even greater test. You see, what had happened in Daniel's life is he rose to very high levels within the Babylonian government. And then, excuse me, in addition to that, there were other takeovers. And so whatever government that he was in, he was getting raised, he was getting promoted to higher and higher levels. But we also remember that when we pass through one test, usually that one test in life is preparing us for a greater test. How many people understand that in life, that life does not offer us easier tests? But a lot of times the tests get harder, the tests get more difficult, the tests get more challenging. But yet we just become stronger because God has brought us through different tests in our life. It's the same situation with Daniel. You see, if we fast forward to Daniel chapter 6, by this time Daniel has been promoted to a very high level within government. And we find ourselves in Daniel chapter 6, and this is the bigger test that God has for Daniel as the underdog. You see, God was faithful to Daniel. Daniel was faithful to God even though he didn't sense him or feel him, and God honored him. But there's an even greater test. And just because you pass the lower test doesn't mean you graduate. Here is what happened to Daniel. Daniel chapter 6, starting in verse 1, it says, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 110 provinces. And he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. So essentially a governor. Okay? There was one governor over each province. There were 120 provinces, and this is what happened. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise over the high officers and protect the king's interests. So at first Daniel was a governor, but then he got promoted to oversee all of these governors. And then it continued on. Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire kingdom. So realize what had happened with Daniel. Daniel was ruled wisely as a governor, so he was promoted essentially to vice emperor. How many people would like to have that title? That wouldn't be a bad title to have, right? He was vice emperor. And then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. Just so you know, we think we have politics here in the United States, right? Politics has always been going on. And so whenever you rise up, and maybe you can even see this in your own business or in the company that you work for, or wherever you're employed, whatever the situation is, you can see that whenever someone moves up, there's always people trying to tear them down. And that's what's happening with Daniel. And these people tried to tear Daniel down, but they're like, it's impossible. The reason is because of this. They couldn't condemn. Number one, he was faithful. Number two, he was always responsible. And number three, he was always trustworthy. Number one, he was faithful. All right? This is what it means to be above reproach. Sometimes we hear this in the New Testament. We hear this as qualifications for elders or for pastors, that they're above reproach. What does above reproach mean? It means that you're above accusation. Not only did you not do anything, but you live in such a way that there couldn't even be an accusation against you. We hear some pastors sometimes today over the last few decades of some people who haven't lived above reproach. And as pastors, it's difficult not just to live so that you don't do things, but that you take the extra step and you make sure that you can't even be blamed for something. And this is the way that Daniel lived. Number one, he was faithful. He was faithful to the commitments that he made. He was faithful to the allegiances that he had, first to God, and then also serving faithfully the government that he was a part of. So number one, he was faithful. Number two, he was responsible. He took responsibility for the roles that he had. And he led them to completion, and he led them to success. He was responsible. And he was completely trustworthy. If someone gave something to Daniel, they absolutely knew it was going to get done. And so here are these people who are coming against Daniel, and they are attacking him. They are trying to attack him, but they were unsuccessful. Why? Because he was faithful, he was responsible, he was trustworthy. He was completely above reproach. You see, here's the biggest issue for today. The biggest issue for today is what Daniel is going to experience in this particular situation. Defy God and worship another. This is what it says in chapter 6, starting in verse 5. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. They said, okay, you know what? If we can't get Daniel because he's so holy, because he's so righteous, then we are going to use that against him. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to set up a plan where the king is going to have to sign this edict, and we give it to him, and they're going to say for 30 days, King Darius, no one can worship anyone but you. And if we find anyone praying or worshiping to anyone else or anything else other than you, they are going to be condemned to death. And Darius is like, cool. Only it leads King Darius into a difficult situation. And this is what happens. Verse 6. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into a den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so that it cannot be changed. An official law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. And so they're like, now we have Daniel, because we know that Daniel always worships the Lord 3 times a day. And so now Daniel's in a predicament. The biggest issue, either to defy God and worship another. Either we worship God completely, or we defy him and we compromise our faith and we start following another God, or we start cutting corners, or we start curving when we should stay straight. We go to the right or we go to the left. And as we continue to be promoted in life in various situations in various ways, we are going to at times be forced to compromise. Maybe compromise at work, maybe compromise with our families, maybe compromise in one way or the other. And in the same way, Daniel was forced to compromise. He had a decision to make, either worship God or be killed. But he also had this other test where he knew God was faithful. Right? And so this is where we find ourselves in verse 10. But when Daniel learned of the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? Because that is where the presence of God is. So he opened up his window and he continued to pray to the Lord Almighty. He says the officials, he prayed 3 times a day, just as he always had done, giving thanks to his God. When the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help, so they went straight to the king and reminded him about this law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into a den of lions? And he's like, of course I did. That decision stands. It's an official law of the Medes and Persians. It cannot be revoked. Verse 13. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, the one of the captives of Judah, is ignoring you, and he still prays to his God 3 times a day. And so that's where we find ourselves, and we realize that sometimes obedience to God still leads to our demise. This is what we learn, even as an underdog, even as an exile from Judah. This is what we learn. We need to honor God anyway. There are going to be times in our lives when we honor God, and it's not going to go into our favor. God can provide for us, God can rescue us, but he doesn't always do that. Even so, we need to honor God. We follow a Jesus who was crucified, and at times we need to bear our cross too. And Daniel realized that. He read the edict and he worshiped God anyway. He would not compromise. As underdogs, we shouldn't compromise either. It continues on. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of the predicament. Verse 15. That evening, the men went together to the king. Your majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no law that the king's signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into a den of lions. The king said to him, may your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. Do you realize what happened with King Darius? King Darius realized that his hands were cuffed. He realized that he had been duped. He realized that all along they were working to get Daniel dead so that someone else could be put in that situation or put into his high honor. And so at this point, King Darius is locking the doors to the den of lions and putting Daniel in there, and he's saying, I hope your God saves you. Isn't that interesting? Here is King Darius, who is supposed to be worshipped by everyone. And even King Darius, who thinks that he's a god at this moment in time, he can't even save Daniel. Do you see in this situation that God showed himself compared to King Darius? Maybe God was working through this entire situation. He's like, I'm going to put Daniel in this den of lions. Or I'm going to allow it to happen, maybe not necessarily proactively put, but allow this to happen. And King Darius is going to have to recognize the fact that I am the God of the universe. But God would never have been able to do that if Daniel were not faithful, reliable, and trustworthy to God. It continues on. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. Then he got there and he called out in anguish, "Daniel, servant of the living God." Do you hear that? Servant of the living God. I know I'm not God. I hope your God saves you because I can't. He calls out in anguish, "Servant of the living God, was your God, whom you served so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions?" Have you ever waited for an answer? And when you hear the answer, it brings joy to your heart. King Darius had been waiting for that answer all night long. He couldn't sleep. And then he heard the response. Daniel answered, "Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty." And the relief that King Darius felt, because he realized that he couldn't save him, so hopefully the God of the universe could. And the king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. When we are underdogs, we honor God, and God will honor us. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den along with their wives and children. The lions leapt on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den, because they did not honor God. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. "Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth, and he has rescued Daniel from the powers of the lion." So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. What do we learn from this? Well, the last point is this. Uncompromising faith can lead to God's miraculous deliverance. God doesn't always promise miraculous deliverance, but there are times when he comes through for our good and for his name's sake. And that's exactly what happened with Daniel. Now, we may never go into a lion's den. We may never have to be persecuted for our faith. There are people around the world who are persecuted for their faith in Jesus. But we may not have to. We might, but we might not have to. But regardless, this is what we can learn from this. This is the big idea. When you enter into the arenas that don't acknowledge God, you will be the underdog. Whether it be at home, whether it be at work, whether it be with friends, whether it be in your neighborhood, whether it be in certain councils you sit on, whatever the situation is, if there are people that do not acknowledge God, for the most part, you will be in the minority. But live honorably, act wisely, speak tactfully, but most of all, obey God uncompromisingly. Obey God uncompromisingly. You see, we see in the life of Daniel that he was tactful. Tact is essentially just using a surgeon's scalpel around the situation. Not trying to ruin anything unnecessary, but only focusing on that which needs to be rightly divided. And then speaking and acting wisely and living honorably, but most of all, just obeying God. Because you plus God is greater than the world. You plus God is greater than the world. And so even though you look like an underdog to everybody else, if you have God on your side, or if you are on God's side, then you are the victor. When you honor God, God will honor you. So where are you the underdog in your life? Is it with your family? or you're struggling with that. I know that sometimes we as followers of Jesus Christ, we come to faith maybe in the midst of a family who does not recognize and still will never recognize Jesus. And that is difficult because you find that at every family reunion and every time you guys get together or every conversation that you're in that constant struggle. They don't understand, they don't agree, and they don't even like the fact that you follow Jesus. Maybe it's at work where you're trying to act honorably, but in the midst of that, there are people that are cooking the books or doing this or doing that or doing whatever sort of situations are going on. And it's difficult for you. You fill in the blank with whatever situation you're dealing with. But remember to honor God in all these situations, and God will honor you. It might look different from Daniel, but the results will be the same. God will work things for your good, for His glory. Would you pray with me?